The seven-stage empire collapse pattern. Why United States is at stage 5. Men in suits kept walking. We think collapse begins with tanks, sirens, and borders on fire. It usually begins with a balance sheet that can't balance, a ledger that won't lie, and a system sliding into insolvency. They'd picture traders, falling stocks, and headlines screaming, "Crisis." But that's not the real event. The real event was bankruptcy made visible. You lose it when you can't pay the bill. You lose it when the bond market says no. Insolvency is the bullet. Now zoom out, not to a battlefield, but to the map. Ports, bases, trade routes, alliances. For decades the web held, because the world needed dollars, and America could always borrow. But listen closely. That web is making a sound. A thin, dry crackle. That's not politics. That's stress in the balance sheet. At its peak, the American story looked like a parade. Aircraft carriers cutting the sea like steel knives. Skyscrapers standing like monuments to triumph. A currency so trusted it became the world's bloodstream. The world didn't just trade with America. The world stored its savings in America's promises. Cheap imports on bright shelves. Gas stations always open. A phone in every hand, made somewhere else, paid for with a card. The dollar felt like gravity. Invisible. Certain. The flags were everywhere too, not just at home. They were stitched into uniforms in deserts and jungles. They were painted on hangars, gates, and concrete walls, overseas. Every missile is steel, oil, and labor translated into money. Empires don't expand on courage alone. They expand on financing, and financing is always borrowed time. The illusion is that might creates wealth. The truth is that wealth pays for might. At the top of the mountain, that difference feels small. At the bottom, it becomes the whole story. And beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Not with one dramatic collapse, but with quiet corrosion. This is where the pattern begins. Not with an enemy, but with an addiction. You run deficits and nothing breaks. You print and the shelves stay stocked. You borrow and interest stays low. You stop asking what things cost. You stop measuring trade-offs. You stop saying no because no is unpopular, and popularity is its own drug. Debt becomes a living thing in the basement. It grows while nobody watches. It eats quietly. It doesn't roar. It whispers. Just one more year. The antagonist is not a general with medals. It's the auction that goes cold. It's the yield that climbs like a fever. People love to talk about enemies abroad. The killer is arithmetic. To understand the seven-stage collapse pattern, you have to understand the engine that drives it. Empires expand, and expansion costs money. When costs rise faster than productive strength, the empire starts paying with tricks. The first trick is reach. You stretch across oceans. You sign security guarantees. You station troops in far places. You believe presence equals control. You also believe control will pay for itself. The second trick is currency. Not with a mint and copper, but with keystrokes and credits. You can buy time. You can hide pain. You can postpone the day of reckoning. The third trick is borrowing. You sell bonds and the world buys them because it assumes you will always be good for it. Each bond is a vote of confidence. You let finance replace manufacturing. You let paper wealth pretend it is real wealth. And then society begins to crack. Not because people suddenly became bad, but because the system becomes unfair. Costs rise. Wages lag, trust leaks out, the streets feel colder. Stage by stage, the pattern repeats. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. Different flags, same ledger, different speeches. Spain looked invincible in the late 1500s. Silver from the Americas poured into its coffers like a river of light. The Spanish real traveled across oceans like a passport to every market. Their armies marched under banners that seemed blessed by fate. But silver is not productivity. Silver is a shortcut. Spain spent treasure like it was proof of immortality. It fought wars across Europe, across seas, across continents. That is the rule of three, and it always comes back. The pound sterling was more than money. It was authority stamped into paper. Then came the bill for dominance. Britain assumed the empire would pay the interest later. By 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard and the pound fell hard. That was not just a policy shift. It was a confession. It was the reserve currency admitting it could not keep the old contract. World War II sealed it. The empire was too expensive to hold. Britain didn't lose India because it wanted to be generous. It lost India because the ledger said it couldn't afford the garrison. The Soviet Union offers the cleanest lesson. It had rockets, tanks, and nuclear firepower. It spent like a superpower on a smaller base. By the late 1980s, the Soviet sphere cracked. Just a system that ran out of solvency. Now, take that old pattern and lay it like tracing paper over the United States. It is the simple truth that global presence requires global funding, and global funding is not infinite. It patrols sea lanes, funds alliances, arms partners, and keeps the watch. This is where accountants become historians, because the real question is not, can America project force? The question is, can America keep paying for it without breaking its own base? That's the first crack in the marble. Stage 2 is currency debasement. The United States does not shave coins like old monarchs. It expands money supply through modern systems, through credit creation, through emergency programs, through quiet machinery most citizens never see. The public feels it as prices. Rent rising, food climbing, insurance swelling. Each increase is a small amputation of purchasing power. It's not a headline. Then it borrows to pay interest on the borrowing. It's like taking a new loan to cover an old habit. You can keep talking while it rises. You can keep smiling while it reaches your chest. At some point, debt servicing becomes a dominant expense. A nation begins working not for its future, but to keep its creditors calm. Stage 4 is loss of productive capacity. It looks like efficiency. It looks like factories moved overseas because it was cheaper. But cheap is not free. You pay later with dependence. You pay later with hollowed skills and rusted towns. You trade muscle for mirrors. Production is power, not in speeches but in crises. When you can't build what you need, you must buy it. When you must buy it, you must have strong currency. This is where the damage becomes visible in the streets and in the mood. Trust fractures. Institutions feel distant. It's financial. When the ledger squeezes, people squeeze each other. When the future feels closed, everyone fights over scraps. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status. It is a subsidy. It lets it borrow cheaply. It lets it run deficits with fewer consequences. It is the invisible hand that keeps the empire's lifestyle affordable. Lose that and the math flips. Budget pain becomes immediate. This is where the phrase sovereignty is solvency becomes literal. Because if you cannot fund yourself, you must accept terms. You must bargain. You must sell assets, cut promises, or print into fire. Not always a dramatic overnight disappearance, but often a sharp break. A political fracture that becomes ungovernable. It is a country discovering it cannot command outcomes anymore. That's what every empire says. Spain said it with silver in its hands. Britain said it with ships in its harbors. The Soviet Union said it with missiles in its silos. The pattern doesn't care. The ledger doesn't care. Math is not impressed by flags. Numbers are where the story stops being opinion and starts being arithmetic. It means you can pay now and explain later. In 2001, a new era of war spending began that lasted far longer than the public expected. Costs stacked up, not just in weapons, but in care, logistics, contracts, and interest. In 2008, the financial system choked, and the response was more credit, more liquidity, more stabilization. The system survived, but it learned a lesson. The monster in the basement grew. Now imagine the ledger as a detective's notebook. Each year the productive base grows slower. The gap is the plot. This is the descent, and it is chronological. First, the empire borrows because it is confident. Then it borrows because it is accustomed. That's the spiral. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. That is how it happens. And it is how it will happen again, because those are not political problems. Those are balance sheet problems. Now we reach the smoking gun moment, the paper that seals fate. Empires always have one. A decree, a treaty, a meeting where the truth is spoken in polite language. Sometimes it's a budget deal that cuts quietly while pretending to reform. Men and women speaking softly because shouting won't change the math. One side says we need time. The other says time costs interest. One side says we are exceptional. Liquidation of autonomy. Liquidation of choices. Because once creditors set the conditions, policy becomes a narrow hallway. Default can be hidden. It can be inflation. It can be devaluation. It can be a broken promise paid back in cheaper dollars. When the climax arrives, it feels sudden to the public. That's because the public doesn't watch the ledger. It is cold. It is the government cutting services. It is wages falling behind prices. It is a population feeling poor even while working harder. Hunger is the oldest economic statistic. Cold is the second. When heating becomes expensive, when food becomes thin, politics becomes brutal. The empire realizes it cannot do what it once did. It cannot bail out every crisis. It cannot promise the world stability. Sovereignty is solvency. Say it again. Sovereignty is solvency. If you cannot pay, you cannot command. If you cannot command, you are no longer an empire, even if your map still looks impressive. New currencies compete. New alliances form. It's young people inheriting bills they never voted for. It's infrastructure aging like teeth. It becomes austerity, lost growth, or a weaker currency. It becomes a scar in the national psyche. It becomes reactive. In the aftermath, people rewrite the story. They say, we fell because of politics, or we fell because of culture, or we fell because of enemies. Those are comforting myths. The harder truth is that the ledger decided. Accountants decided. Empires are just the visible skin over a financial skeleton. It is not that collapse is guaranteed tomorrow. It is that collapse becomes more likely when a nation treats arithmetic as optional. You cannot spend beyond production forever. You cannot outsource the base and keep the crown. You cannot print value without consequences. You cannot keep expanding obligations without eventually meeting a wall.